Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we pick up the Delhi edition of today's The Hindu newspaper, analyze the articles which are relevant for your examination, be it for the prelims or the mains. Now, today what we are going to do is, after few of the topics, we are also going to analyze the multiple choice questions which can be framed from those particular topics. Because it is very important for you to understand not only the articles themselves, but what is their relevance from the point of view of examination. So along with the mains questions that we are going to discuss at the end of the session, how to go for answer writing, today we are also going to take up few of the multiple choice questions, and I want you to solve those multiple choice questions and put the answers in the comment section below. Try to get the maximum of them correct. Now, before looking at the topics that we are going to discuss for today, an announcement regarding an exclusive offer for students who are seeking to join the English course from end-to-end preparation for civil services, including availability of course books, materials, guidance, and one-on-one mentorship. We have the flat 50% off plus 6 months extension period, which ends today. So the offer ends on 14th of April. So do contact this number to get further details. Now, after this, taking a look at the topics that we are going to hold a discussion for. So today in total, we are going to discuss around 9 different topics. And out of them, 4 are the ones that we are going to discuss in slightly greater detail, because these will have their relevance for the mains examination as well. And then the remaining 5 of them, we are going to discuss them briefly because of their relevance only in the prelims perspective. And as I told you, in the portion of the mains topics, we are going to pick up the MCQs, multiple choice questions, wherever possible. So let us start with the first topic of the day. And the first topic basically talks about the concurrent heat waves and sea level rises poses a threat to the coastline. Now, this is a particular article which has appeared in the science section of the newspaper. And this article is relevant for your preparation in GS paper 1 and also in the paper of GS paper 3. Now, what is this article about? This is based on a study, a detailed study, which has been carried out by professors in the Hong Kong University. Now, what they have done is they have measured the data for the past few decades in order to measure that the coastal areas, what do they go through when the conditions are very, very hot. Now, there they have found out that not only do the coastal areas are increasingly suffering from the events of heat waves, but along with that, they are suffering from extreme sea level rise. For a temporary duration though, but they are suffering from that extreme sea level rise. Now, this is something which does not fit the popular perception or the preconceived notions that we have. Generally, when we talk about the coastal area, the understanding is very simple, that they won't experience extremities of climate. It is the interior areas, for example, Delhi, for example, Chandigarh, for example, Ambala. In these areas, you would have witnessed that the summertime temperature exceeds around 45-47 degrees Celsius and the wintertime temperature is around 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. So these regions which are inland, they experience extremity of temperature. But when you consider regions such as Mumbai, Chennai, Goa, Puri, Kolkata. Now these regions, they don't experience extremity of temperatures. So that is the conception and that is the larger understanding. Now, what this study has indicated, that the coastal areas are experiencing heat waves. Now, first of all, why is it very briefly that the coastal areas do not experience extremity? In general, ideally, on paper, the coastal areas should not experience extremity of temperature. Why? That is because when we talk about the coastal areas, they will have a water body, the sea or the ocean. Now, when we talk about heating during the day, it is the temperature gain during the day which leads to higher degree Celsius in measurement. Now, during the day, the heating of the land is quite significant, but the heating of water is not at the same proportion because the energy gets dissipated through the region of the water. Now, as a result of that, During the day, during the afternoons, the temperature of the nearby water and the temperature of the land areas, they differ. Now, because of that thermal difference, there is a thermal difference which is created. Because of this thermal difference which is created, it gives rise to local winds. Local winds in the form of land and sea breeze, which basically end up moving on a daily basis. That means you will have a wind moving from land to the sea, and during the night, you will have a breeze moving from sea to the land. So what these land and sea breeze they end up doing, they moderate the temperature. Extreme heat, extreme cold conditions, they are carried away by the wind. So that leads to general temperature distribution and hence maintenance of temperature, moderate temperature. So that is why in the coastal areas under normal conditions, what you expect ideally is maintenance of a moderate temperature. But that is not happening. Heat waves are being experienced. Now, because of these heat waves, there is an extreme sea level rise which is happening even though for a temporary duration. Why and how? And what is this event? And what are the implications of this? Let us understand it. So, when we have heat waves, when is it that we refer to a condition as a heat wave? Every particular region, every particular country has got a different delineation. But in India, we refer to the heat wave conditions when in any plain region, the temperature exceeds 40 degrees Celsius and experiences a departure of 4 to 6 degrees Celsius as compared to the normal temperature. For example, if today is 14th of April, any region is experiencing 41 degrees Celsius today. And ideally, on 14th of April last year or the year before that, they would have experienced 34, 35 degrees Celsius. But today they are experiencing 41 degrees Celsius. So that region will be declared as suffering from heat wave. That threshold varies in the hilly areas as compared to the plain areas. So heat waves basically in simplest of the terms is extreme heat conditions which are prevalent. Extreme conditions of temperature which are prevalent. Now, why does that happen? That can be attributed to multiple factors. Change in the wind pattern, change in the vegetation cover, also the impact of the vegetation cover change in the amount of rainfall received. So lesser rainfall means higher temperature conditions. So because of that, heat waves are being suffered. Now, what these heat waves are leading to, understand this. Again, the same image. Let's suppose we consider a coastal area. Here you have a water body, the sea or the ocean. If the temperature of the land starts rising almost exponentially, then what will happen? We will say, or we can conclude that the water body is in contact with a very hot temperature body, whose temperature is very high, whose energy level is very high. So, by the impact of conduction, by the process of conduction, heat will be transferred. So, transfer of heat through conduction. And eventually, convection will lead to distribution of heat within the water. Now, if the heat is transferred to the water, then what do we have to do with that? It can lead to the rise in sea surface temperature, but why are we experiencing the sea level rise here? That is because when the sea water gets heated up, there is a thermal expansion. Any state of matter, let's suppose this pen, if I heat it up, it will tend to expand. If I cool it down, it will tend to contract. So any object which gets heated tends to expand. Over the past 100 years, when we talk about the sea level rise, the popular perception is what? That the sea level is rising purely because of the melting of ice and glaciers. And we feel that as much amount of ice and glacier they are melting, the sea level is rising exponentially. But that is incorrect. majority of the sea level rise, 50% of the sea level rise in the past century and half, is attributed to thermal expansion of water. Water as a state of matter tends to expand. And when water tends to expand, obviously the sea level in that region will rise. Now, where will this thermal expansion be observed? In the regions where the heat received is very high. And where is that? In the tropics, within the tropical areas. So that is why this is something which leads to thermal expansion of water. Expansion. And that leads to rise in sea level. So that is how this change in weather phenomena is being observed. That because of these extreme heat waves, and why these heat waves are occurring, again a quick revision: changing wind patterns due to climate change, then the cutting of the coastal vegetation means there's a dispersal of the rainfall pattern, the rains are not happening regularly, and so on, so the temperature rises up. Now, as the sea level is rising up in the coastal areas, what is the point of concern? When we talk about countries such as India, where we have close to around 7,500 kilometers of coastline, what is it that is concerning or that should be concerning for us? Sea level rise always leads to significant amount of coastal flooding. Coastal flooding events increase. For example, if you take a look at the regions such as Mumbai, Chennai, now in these areas, coastal floodings are initiated even when there is a cyclonic rainfall. Whenever there is the slightest of the storm surge, the entire city almost gets flooded. In the region of Chennai, last year, we observed the horrific incident where even the oil leakages were happening in that flooded water. So that is a dangerous proposition that we are staring at. So when we take a look at the impacts overall, first is coastal flooding. Right? Now also, if the sea level has risen up, there will be impact of the waves and the tides further inland now. And that means what? The areas which were earlier not protected, they are now exposed to the vagaries of the sea. So that will give rise to significant amount of coastal erosion. Almost all the coastal countries across the world, including India, we are suffering from heavy cases of coastal erosion. For example, our satellite launch station is where? It is in Sriharikota. Now, that is across the coastline. Now, I hope you are aware that in Sriharikota, that is a region where many thousands of square meters of coastal land have already been taken up by the sea. And slowly and steadily, the sea is coming closer to the launching pad. So that is an impact which is the coastal erosion, which can influence the case of livelihoods as well. Coastal livelihoods, livelihood of the people, farmers living in the coastal areas. Now, whenever this event of coastal flooding happens, it is not as if once the floods recede, the situations are back to normal. No. When the sea water comes in, it is not like a river flooding. Rivers bring fresh water. Along with that alluvium, they will get deposited in the soil. The soil will become fertile. But when we talk about this coastal flooding, it brings salt water. Saline water inundates the farmland. It floods the farmlands. And when that water retreats or evaporates, the salt is left behind. And that salt further deteriorates the soil quality. It makes the soil very alkaline. And that is what renders the entire region unfit for cultivation or agriculture whatsoever. So here there is an agricultural loss due to formation of alkaline soil. Then many areas of pristine regions of biodiversity are also impacted. For example, in India itself, you have a report that was generated yesterday which talked about the fact that how olive ridley turtles who come to the beaches of Odisha near Gahirmatha, now these olive ridley turtles, their nesting phase, when they come to the beaches, the coastal sands, and they lay their eggs and the eggs hatch, that process is very critical for the survivability of the larger population. That is why those beaches are protected so significantly. But then what has been happening is, due to the coastal erosion, the areas where they could go for nesting, that has significantly reduced. Now, in lesser area, you will have more number of nestings which happen, means the eggs will be more vulnerable to attacks and destruction. So that is another kind of biodiversity loss or an impact. Now, if there is a substantial and a temporary rise in the seawater level suddenly in the coastal region, what happens? Generally, there is that thermal expansion which happens, due to which there is a sea level rise. Now, that means you have warm water which is on top, and that warm water always gives rise to the formation of cyclonic storms, which causes a lot of destruction and devastation in the coastal regions. So, the warm waters give rise to storms, to cyclonic storms, frequent and much more intense. The cyclones are getting stronger and stronger with each passing day and each passing season. Also, this rise in sea level water also means that in many of the areas, the rock debris and additional nutrients are being unnecessarily supplied to the seawater. Now, that is something which can lead to harmful algal blooms as well. Harmful algal blooms are never beneficial for any water body. It leads to eventually eutrophication, and the water turns out to be hypoxic, that is drained out of oxygen. That is where the survivability of the coral reefs is very, very important. While the coral reefs themselves, they don't get directly influenced by the rise of the sea level water, but they can eventually, over a long process, get impacted indirectly, but not a direct impact. So here another impact is rise in or harmful algal bloom. Now, these are the issues. Now, what is the way forward in order to get rid of this heat waves in the coastal areas and extreme sea level rise conditions? The solutions are very simple. In the coastal areas, one can go for mangrove cultivation and the planting of the mangrove trees. Mangroves, they act as a barrier not only against coastal erosion, but add to the green cover, which significantly aids in the rain-bearing winds formation as well. So there can be frequent formation of rainfall, which will cool down the temperature and get rid of the heat wave conditions. India is already a party to the Mangrove Alliance for Climate, which was initiated by UAE and Indonesia a couple of years ago. So under that initiative itself, like India, like UAE, like Indonesia, Australia, many other countries can actually try to increase the mangrove vegetation. Secondly, areas of extreme coastal erosion needs to be basically notified, and they need to be demarcated, so that protective bunds, concrete barriers, embankments, etc. can be built in the regions wherever it is required to protect the coastal region. Thirdly, the movement in the wave and the wind pattern needs to be studied carefully, and preemptive steps can be taken that, okay, for the next, as the pattern is continuing for the next decade, maybe Odisha will experience more coastal erosion. So such preemptive measures need to be taken. Cooperatives at the local level will also help in community participation in the protection of the coastal area. After all, it is the life of the fisher folk who are also getting impacted by this. So all these measures, from plantation and cultivation of mangroves, increasing the green cover, to going for hazard zonation and demarcation of the areas prone to it, to going for the localized community level structure, building of dams and embankments, all of them can be a measure to restore the coastal landscape. Coastal landscape is very critical, guys. That houses large amount of biodiversity. It is a transition between the terrestrial ecosystem and a marine ecosystem. So in that ecotone, you have a large number of various different types of clams, shells, shell-bearing animals, etc., which live in the coastal ecosystem. So its conservation is of paramount importance. Okay. Now let's take a look at the objective question which can be framed from here. Consider the following events: coastal flooding, increased alkalinity of coastal soil, loss of biodiversity, and coral bleaching. Which of the following events are triggered by a rise in sea level? Only one event, only two events, three events, or all the four events? Which of them can be triggered by the rise of the seawater? So, take a look at this question and reply to it in the comment section. Put the answer. What do you think is the correct answer for this? Now, after this, coming to the second article, and that is the article associated with hepatitis. Now, a report has been published by WHO, and that report is the Global Hepatitis Report. Hepatitis Report 2024. Now, as per this report, 11.5% of all the hepatitis cases in the world, they lie in country of India. And if you talk about the countries such as, let's suppose, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Russia, Vietnam, Ethiopia, these few countries, they comprise for more than 2/3 of the hepatitis cases across the world. Now, this is one of the first comprehensive health reports which has been published for hepatitis, because generally the exact incidence of the hepatitis as a disease is largely not very well known. Now, when we talk about hepatitis, you have various strains of hepatitis, from hepatitis A all the way till hepatitis E. It is hepatitis B and C which impacts the human health quite significantly. It is caused by a viral infection in most of the cases. Okay, so hepatitis B and C are the causes of concern significantly in our country. Now here one has to understand that there are certain reasons why there is a greater incidence of diseases such as hepatitis B and C in countries like India. Because the report indicates that the amount of casualties and the amount of infections claimed by hepatitis B and C, they are almost equal to tuberculosis, which is the most infectious disease in the world. So you have a kind of infection rate which is almost similar, which in itself is an alarming piece of information. Now here, hepatitis B and C, they impact a large section of the population, mostly in the age group of 30 to 54 years. 30 to 54 years. Now, this is a working age population. Now, in well-to-do jobs or in well-to-do families, you can withstand that shock of a disease. But in poor families where the only bread earner suffers from a disease like this, there is a significant loss of income, out-of-pocket expenditure, leading to impoverishment and continued form of impoverishment. So that is again an issue. Now, other than that, this report also highlights that when we talk about hepatitis, almost 58% of the incidence of infection are observed in the male members. So the male members, they are influenced by this at a disproportionate level. These are few of the highlights of the report. Now let us analyze this in Indian context, and then we will have an idea about what we can do going ahead. So in India, hepatitis B and C, they are very widespread. Now what is the reason for that? So when we analyze the reasons, it can be bifurcated into the kind of living conditions as well. It can be then divided into the natural causes as well. So why is it that these diseases are so very significantly common in our country? One of the first factor that is indicated is that this virus significantly can remain in a dormant stage. So many of the bodies, many of the individuals, they carry that viral load, but they don't indicate any symptom. And then they can get impacted by the symptoms of it much later. But in the meanwhile, that individual would have spread that virus with the help of food, drinks, or with the help of sexual intercourse, etc., into a larger set of population as well. And that is how, in a very dormant stage, that virus can spread out. So that is one of the major reasons. So here you can say that virus remains load in the body remains for a very long time. Right? Secondly, in our country, you ask the people around you. You go and ask your neighbors, maybe your grandparents, anyone. Majority of them will not be aware about what are the symptoms of hepatitis and what is the impact of it. So majority of the people are not aware. So lack of awareness also means that even if you are suffering from that, you don't go out to seek the cure. And the condition keeps on worsening. Not only that, all the meanwhile you are spreading that virus as well. So lack of awareness. Okay? Then other than that, in our country again, as is the case with many of the developing nations, you do not have a proper screening program. So when we say that the around 11.6% of the global cases are in India, we still do not have the exact idea about the number of cases that we have. It is a pure, a kind of a guesstimate. You are guessing it and having an estimate out of it. So lack of proper screening facilities at the private healthcare centers, at the primary healthcare centers, that is one of the major causes. Now, for hepatitis screening, if you are aware that I should get tested, that in itself is a rare phenomena. Then finding that in the nearest public health center, primary health center, that is also again a rare phenomena. So you cannot have both of them working for you, right? So awareness, and secondly, making available these tests and the screening programs on a regular basis across a larger section of the population by strengthening the primary healthcare centers. So here, lack of screening. Then, after that, you also have issues. For example, hepatitis impacts what? Hepatitis as a disease will impact your liver. Now, hepatitis as a disease, what does it create? It causes inflammation and inflammation of the liver. The liver experiences that inflammation, due to which its functionality gets impacted, and the liver secretes the very important bile, and that is relevant for and important for the digestion process as well, and also for the hormonal balance in the body. But once that inflammation in the liver is experienced, its functionality starts reducing, and in certain cases, it can lead to the liver shutting down. So the impact of hepatitis in general is basically liver cirrhosis, liver cancer, and sometimes even leading to multiple organ failure. So that is the overall impact. That is why it is considered to be so very dangerous. So you have liver cirrhosis, where again the liver swells. You have then after that liver cancer, when you would need a transplant and shutdown or organ failure. Okay, that is the aspect. Now, while these are initiated by the viral infection, sometimes the ease of attaining or suffering from liver cirrhosis is also because of the lifestyle diseases that people suffer from. For example, in our country, you have an abnormally large number of fatty liver diseases which are spread across the population. In our country, you have significant amount of fatty liver diseases. Fatty liver does not mean that your liver actually becomes fat. That is not fatty liver. Fatty liver means there's a deposition of that excess layer of fat around that liver, which is never good for the healthy functionality of that liver. So that fatty liver is caused because of, it is of two types. One is alcoholic fatty liver. So the consumption of alcohol on a large scale, that leads to that fatty liver. So you are more prone to the damaging impact by hepatitis. And second is non-alcoholic fatty liver. Now, why do you suffer from non-alcoholic fatty liver? That is because of the lifestyle conditions, sedentary lifestyles, where the physical exercises, they are not happening. Then you are not very active during the day. So automatically, and the kind of food habits, already we know that we are facing from two extremities across the globe. One is malnutrition, the other is obesity. Both of them, they talk about a kind of misnutrition, where you are not having the proper kind of nutrition which is given. So that is where these lifestyle diseases, they also influence hepatitis. Then, in most of the cases, in developing countries, you will find that when a newborn or a new baby is born, 90% of them suffer from hepatitis. 90% of them. Now, while and if the institutional delivery happens and proper care is taken, the babies recover through. And very quickly they shed that virus. But then, when you talk about non-institutional deliveries, and when you talk about lack of proper care in the primary healthcare centers, that is when it tends to exaggerate. And that is when it leads to infant mortality as well, in many of the cases neonatal mortality itself, that within 5 days, within 10 days, the kid does not survive. So that is where you have increased incidence in newborns. And here, lack of proper institutional delivery and proper Medicare, that further exaggerates it. So these are the reasons why in developing countries like India, you have so much high incidence of hepatitis. What is the remedy of it? What is the way forward? The way forward, for each and every reason, think about a counter argument, as simple as that. First of all, awareness raising programs need to be given. Secondly, when we talk about vaccines, we have vaccines developed for hepatitis B. And way back in 2011, 2012 itself, the vaccines of hepatitis B were included in the universal immunization program of the government. But that needs to be much more uniform, and that needs to be much more penetrative in terms of its execution, so that none of the population is left behind. Then after that, we need to go for a healthcare worker-based intervention at the local level, and the local populace need to be brought to the picture. Then, the primary healthcare centers, they are the nodal points of functionality. These primary healthcare centers need to have the screening program, regular screening program, which encourages the public to come to them to get themselves tested as well. Only then will we get an appropriate idea of what is the level of infection. And after that, also, one of the reasons why this hepatitis is very prominent is proper sanitation, clean drinking water, and availability of good food, hygienic food. That is very important, because one of the major drivers of hepatitis C, for that matter, is that particular infection coming from dirty water unclean food, and unhygienic systems. So here you can also write it here as a reason, lack of proper cleanliness. And in this you can include hygiene conditions, sanitation, food, water, etc. Okay, so that is basically the entire gist of the article. So again, a quick recap. What have we studied? A greater incidence of this particular disease in countries like India, and they have an impact at the same level as tuberculosis. Significant section of the population is suffering from that. 58% of that incident is in the male population. Amongst the demography, 30 to 54 years age group is the one which is suffering, which means the working age population is suffering, which means out-of-pocket expenditure, loss of livelihood, impoverishment. Now, what are the reasons why it spreads so significantly in countries like India? Before that, what is this hepatitis in itself? What portion of the body it impacts? So, impacts the liver, leads to inflammation of the liver and curtailment of the functionality of the liver. Liver doesn't function as properly. Then, why does it spread? From various reasons: lack of clean food, clean water, and hygienic facilities, proper sanitation facilities, they are lacking. That means the virus spreads. The virus stays as a dormant load in the body of the organisms and individual bodies for a long period of time, for decades maybe. And in that time period, an individual can be a carrier of the virus and can spread it to various different areas. Lack of proper awareness, lack of screening, and you also have the fatty liver diseases, which are very prominent because of alcohol consumption and also because of the sedentary lifestyle. So obesity is linked with fatty liver. In majority of the cases, you will find that obese people, they have the issue of fatty liver, so they will be much more vulnerable to this. So that is something, along with the fact that in many of the primary healthcare centers, the poor state of healthcare and maintenance of poor state of healthcare when it comes to maternal condition and delivery of the newborn, that also further exaggerates the issue. What is the way forward is also something we have discussed. Okay. Now, a simple question can be framed from this in your prelims examination. So, which of these organizations releases the Global Hepatitis Report? Okay. So, WHO, UNHCR, UNDP, World Hepatitis Forum. Which of them releases the Global Hepatitis Report? Take a look at it, understand this, and write the answer in the comment section. Now, then coming to the next topic, next article. Next article is, how did the law on disclosure of assets evolve? Now, this article basically finds its place in the newspaper because of the news stories doing the round around the constituency of Thiruvananthapuram. Thiruvananthapuram this year is considered to be a high-profile electoral battle because on one side you have the Congress stalwart of Shashi Tharoor, and on the other side you have Rajiv Chandrasekhar, who has functioned as a minister in the union government. So, that is a high-pitched electoral battle which is going on. Now, recently a kind of a masala mixture was added to this battle by the allegations that Rajiv Chandrasekhar actually has not declared his entirety of the assets. And that puts him on the verge of getting disqualified, or in a proper wording, he can be liable to get disqualified from fighting the elections. Even if, let's suppose, he wins the election, even after that, his election process can be declared as void. But simultaneously, another news also started picking up pace and it started doing rounds. And that is an old Supreme Court judgment which talked about the fact that, look, when it comes to the declaration of assets, now, the individual candidates, they do not need to declare each and every asset that they have. They also have a right to privacy. But any asset which is substantial, which is significant, that needs to be declared. right? If let's suppose I have not declared this electric or the electronic pen that I have, or let's suppose I have not declared this particular television screen that I have, it doesn't make much of a difference in my electoral process, does it? So those events or those kind of declarations, the Supreme Court has provided a kind of a exemption from there. So does that mean that he can be exempted from being liable to declaring the election void, or he can be exempted from the punishment which the others are seeking for? So that is what the entire article is about. Now here, declaration of assets. Declaration of assets by the legislators, by the people who are running for elections, that is a very vital part in our electoral democracy. That is why before the election, all of you would be flooded with the news stories that this legislator or this MP is the richest individual in this phase of election. This MP has got so many crores worth of assets, and so on and so forth. How do we know that? Because of that declaration of the asset. Did it always exist like this? No. You had a very famous case, including a landmark judgment. So basically, you had a case of Union of India versus Association for Democratic Reforms. ADR, and others. So this was a kind of a landmark case. Under this particular case, the Supreme Court issued a judgment in 2002. And Supreme Court noticed that, look, a voter's right to vote is paramount in an electoral democracy. Now, equally paramount and equally important is the voter's right to information. Right to information for what? For what my candidate has. Whether my candidate is having a kind of a criminal offense which is pending, whether the candidate who is running for the election has got less assets, more assets. So for all of this, the voters need to be informed. So the gist of this judgment was voters' right to information. Right to information is paramount. And the Supreme Court issued a guideline to the Election Commission. And Supreme Court basically asked the Election Commission that, look, as per the powers provided to you by Article 324 of the Constitution, you issue the guidelines to ensure that criminal proceedings, past criminal cases, assets of not only you but the entire family, that should be declared. So the Election Commission came up with that kind of a declaration. Now, the government, the central government of that point of time, it basically wanted to override it. That is where the amendment was provided by the government to the Representations of People's Act, 1951. Now, as per the amendment, so the Election Commission came up with the entire details that these are required. To give you the entire context of it, this is what the Supreme Court asked the Election Commission to do. Supreme Court had asked the Election Commission that as per the powers provided to the Election Commission under Article 324, each and every candidate, when they are filing their nomination paper, they have to declare whether the candidate is convicted, acquitted or discharged of any criminal offense, or whether punished with imprisonment or fine, whether that has happened earlier or not. Prior to 6 months of filing of nomination, whether the candidate is accused in any pending cases, assets, movable, immovable, bank balances, etc. Liabilities, if any, particularly whether there are dues, etc., which are pending, which can lead to insolvency of the candidate. So all of these, the Election Commission had basically issued the guideline. The Union government, as a result of that, came up with the amendment. Amendment to Representations of People's Act, 1951. Now, as per this amendment, the central government brought about certain amended sections. For example, under this, it brought about 33A, 33B, and also along with that, 125A. The sections 33A, 33B, and 125A, these were the amended portions in the Representation of People's Act. What did they talk about? 33A talked about the declaration of criminal cases which are pending, of pending criminal cases. Then after that, the 33B, it talked about that there is no need to have that disclosure. It circumvented the entire Supreme Court judgment and the direction given to the Election Commission. So, circumvented the disclosure norms. Then 125A, it talked about the fact that if, let's suppose, you are issuing that disclosure and that disclosure is not correct, that disclosure is false. So falsifying of information can lead to initiation of criminal charges. So criminal charges to be initiated due to falsification of information. Right. Now, these were the amendments that the government brought in 2022, within a couple of months itself. Then again, ADR took this amendment and the amended Representation of People's Act again to the doorsteps of the Supreme Court. What the Supreme Court did, Supreme Court cancelled and declared this as void. This was actually declared as incorrect by the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court continued with the remainder of the portions with the thought process that this is strengthening the voters' right to information. So since that point of time, largely, this norm has prevailed, where while filing the nomination paper, the candidate has to declare whether there are criminal cases, what are the assets of the individuals. And if there have been events where that declaration have turned out to be false, there has been action which has also been taken. And here, a case of particular importance and relevance is of Karikho Cree. Now, Karikho Cree was an individual. As an independent candidate, he won the election in Arunachal Pradesh in 2010. Now, the opposition candidate from Congress at that point of time, he basically filed a petition in the High Court. The High Court of that region, the Itanagar branch of the High Court, that is where the petition was filed. And the petition talked about the fact that Karikho Cree has basically falsified the information. When the High Court took a detailed look at it, High Court basically observed that he had not declared 2 or 3 cars that he owned previously, which he had sold to some other individual 2 to 3 years ago. But that ownership transfer, the transfer of the name had not happened till now. So those cars were not declared. Then also, the no objection certificate after vacating a government bungalow when he was the MLA, that NOC was also not furnished. Based upon these flimsy grounds, Karikho Cree was disbarred from the election. The election was declared void. Think about it. So these are the grounds on which the elections could be declared as void. Now, this matter was taken up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court basically sidelined the entire judgment of the High Court. Supreme Court said that, look, if an individual had 3 cars which they had sold long time back, and if the no objection certificate regarding a government bungalow, these are the materials which has not been declared, This will hardly make any change in the electoral process. This will hardly make any change in terms of the voter influence. This will hardly make any change in the terms of the voter choice. So when these are not going to impact the elections, why should we declare the election void? So that is where Supreme Court came up with a kind of an aspect and an observation that, look, candidates also have their own individual rights of privacy. Now, those rights of privacy need not be crossed over for these petty declarations. If you have a larger declaration which has an influence on election, you have to make it. But does not mean that this pen, this remote, this mobile phone, each and everything you start declaring. But simultaneously, Supreme Court very significantly aware that how this loophole can be exploited by the politicians and the candidates. It also said that, look, this is not going to be a one-size-fits-all strategy, that everybody is following this. We are going to take it on a case-by-case basis. And that is what the observation of the High Court should also be there. So that is the entire evolution of the process and the entire journey for the disqualification based upon the failure to disclose the entire assets that you have. And that is the entire controversy in which Rajiv Chandrasekhar finds himself embroiled in. So the take of this particular article will be that as long as the candidates' overall disclosure, they do not hide any of the substantial chunk of money, property, or criminal cases which can influence the voter behavior, that is something which can be looked upon. And that is something which can be overlooked. Okay, that is the observation of the Supreme Court, and that is generally in the well-functionality and the well-being of the democratic setup as well. The more rules that you codify, the more stringent it starts to become. The presence of flexibility is important in maintaining the diversity in the electoral setup. Okay, now after that we come to the next article, and the next article is the trend in climate change jurisprudence, relevant for your GS paper 3. Now this article, which is present in the FAQ section of the newspaper, it talks about the fact that how there has been, and this is largely a follow-up of the recent Supreme Court judgment, where the Supreme Court cited the right against climate change, impact of climate change, as a basic fundamental right for the individuals under the overall purview of right to life. Now, this is regarding a case which was filed in the Supreme Court for the Great Indian Bustard. Now, Great Indian Bustard is a species of great importance in our country. It is critically endangered globally, right? When we talk about the Great Indian Bustard, it is critically endangered. And where do you find them? The regions. You'll find them to be present in the regions of Rajasthan, Gujarat, but not only that, even in the areas of Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, the drier areas. There also ideal habitat exists, and some numbers in single digits though, very little numbers, they do exist. So when we talk about regions, they are in the area of Rajasthan, Gujarat, Telangana, and Andhra Pradesh. But majorly Rajasthan and Gujarat, that is where the population of Great Indian Bustard is. Now, this Great Indian Bustard, when it moves from one region to another, when it takes flight, it does not take a very high flight. It takes a low flight. But when it takes that flight, it is getting impacted by the electrical lines which have increased in terms of their density in the region of Rajasthan and Gujarat. Because Rajasthan and Gujarat, they are quickly turning out to be the solar power generation hubs of our country. So the increased density and the presence of electrical lines means many of these birds, which is the state bird of Rajasthan, they are getting impacted, they are getting killed. So a case was taken to the Supreme Court. Now the Supreme Court formed a committee to look into that. Immediately the demand was that, look, all the various electrical lines, they need to be taken to the underground level, go for the underground cabling, as is done in many of the cities now, so that these birds can have a carefree existence. But the electrical companies came back and they told them that, look, if we go for that laying of underground cables for the entirety of the distance, that would significantly and substantially increase our cost. And that cost means a higher cost of solar power. Higher cost of solar power means that there will be a kind of lesser consumption. People will not buy that much solar power. And that will be opposing the government's own goal to generate more renewable and more clean energy. So it is basically not conducive to the government's goal of fighting against climate change. That is what the electrical companies came back as a reply. So the Supreme Court formed an empowered committee, a task group, to look into this. It is in that particular case where the Supreme Court has come up with the kind of a judgment where the right to environment, healthy environment, and the right against climate change have been declared as a fundamental right. Now, this follows a string of Supreme Court judgments earlier also. There have been some of the very prolific judgments. For example, the Godavarman case. The Godavarman case of 1996 is considered to be landmark because it led to a protection of the forests. Then you have the very prolific MC Mehta case, which talked about emissions and effluents being generated from the industries. Right? So this particular case is also being highlighted at the same level. So if you talk about the prolific cases, one is the Godavarman case. Godavarman case. This led to the conservation of forest and prevention of deforestation. Then you had the very famous MC Mehta case. This was for the industrial effluents and discharges being released by the industries in the region around Delhi, and then later on it was expanded in terms of its observation across the entire industrial complex across the country. So what does this indicate? This tells you that oftentimes the Supreme Court is the one which sets the parameters by these judgments. Now understand, Supreme Court, even in this Great Indian Bustard case, Supreme Court has basically observed that, look, it is not as if the government is not doing anything. The government of India has passed various legislations. Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, Water Conservation and Prevention of Pollution Act 1974, then Forest Act 1980, Air Act of 1981, Environment Act of 1986, then after that Biodiversity Act of 2002 and the National Green Tribunal Act of 2010. So the government of India has passed various legislations for environmental protection. But it does not have an overarching umbrella legislature which will take a look at all of them. That creates loopholes which are being exploited. But regardless of that loopholes, individuals have a personal fundamental right against climate change and for healthy environment as per Article 14 and Article 21. Because the Supreme Court noticed and observed that, look, when we talk about the poor sections of the society, they will always get significantly more impacted by these events of climate change, of the changing land patterns, etc. So how we look at the environment, that is changing. It is being provided as a fundamental right. Environmental protection is given greater importance. And Supreme Court attaching that importance means there will be legislative moves coming in the future as well. Many of the actions by the industries will be put under purview. While it is not to the other extremity like the Greta Thunberg movement for climate, but nonetheless, this judgment by the Supreme Court achieves a significant milestone in terms of making the people aware and also significantly the government aware of protection of environment. Okay. Now here for your examination, the Great Indian Bustard can be relevant. It is the population of Great Indian Bustard which is significantly declining, and that is of a cause of concern. Recent reports indicated that in the regions of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, Great Indian Bustard has not been sighted for a long time. So that again puts them into spotlight. Now these are large birds which take flight. Now they don't fly very high. Now these do not reproduce a lot of young ones, right? They lay a very few eggs and they go for parenting for almost an year. So that is why it is not as if they are producing a lot of offsprings as well. So the population increase is limited, but the existing habitat is in danger. Why? Existing habitat is in danger because of increased desertification which is happening in some of the regions. Also, building of infrastructure that has basically fragmented the habitat, hunting and poaching. Now that is also a significant cause of concern. And many of the birds, they move trans-border. For example, there was a sighting in the Cholistan region of Pakistan of the Great Indian Bustard, and it was suspected that this would have flown from across the border, from India to Pakistan. Once that cross movement happens, there you don't have that stringent laws of conservation. There they are hunted down. And the birds and the wildlife don't know the political boundaries, do they? So that is what puts them at a great risk. Okay? Now, then take a look at the question. Consider the following statements for Great Indian Bustard. They are categorized as threatened as per the new IUCN listing. They reproduce quickly with large number of hatchlings born every year. Which of the above statements is or are incorrect? Do take a look at this. Let us know what the answer is in the comment section. So what you can do, question 1, question 2, question 3, what your answers are. Okay? Now, after this, we move to a set of articles relevant only for your prelims. So starting with the cradle bond of the Muria tribe. Now this article, with the help of this image, also indicates or talks about the Muria tribe in general. Now it talks about a very unique custom of the Muria tribe. Muria tribe largely to be found in which regions, by the way? States of Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Chhattisgarh and Odisha. So that portion of the country around Dandakaranya. Then they speak Koya, that is the Dravidian language. They have progressive perspective towards marriage and life as compared to the other tribal communities. And they have the system of establishing and building Ghotul, which is a dormitory or a commune which is meant to create a safe environment for the Muria youth to understand their sexuality as well. And that leads to a prevention of crimes, sexual nature of crimes in general. So that is significantly relevant for the Muria tribe. Now, this particular tribe, they have a very unique custom where the father of the child, when a newborn arrives, at that point of time, the father goes to the forest, cuts down the bamboo or collects the bamboo, dries that up, and with his own hand, he basically weaves a basket, a wooden basket, a cane basket as you can refer to. That basket gets basically associated with the newborn. And that basket stays with the newborn for life. So in a way, this is a unique custom which in a way encourages the father-son bond. Okay, that particular basket is what is referred to as the vukada. This vukada, as long as the newborn is small enough or the young one is small enough, they stay in that basket. That basket is hung from a tree, hung from the rooftops in the houses, etc. But when the young one outgrows that basket, they keep that basket, and that basket is not used for any other purpose whatsoever. Okay, so this basically passes on from one generation to another. The next generation will also weave their own basket without any help from anyone. So that is the unique vukada for the Muria tribe, which you can understand, which you can extract from this. Then, fort in Fort Kochi cries for conservation. Now, Kochi on the coastline of Kerala has been historically a region where different foreign colonial powers, they have always viewed that region as an entry point. And you have had historically various different colonial powers venturing in, setting a foothold. So the first ones who came there were the Portuguese. And then came the Dutch, then came the English. But when the Portuguese came over, the Portuguese, they were looking for spice trade, particularly pepper, as the Vasco da Gama had already done before. So that is something that they were interested in. So the Portuguese basically entered into a strategic alliance with the Maharaja of Kochi. And as a result of that strategic alliance, there was a fort which was built at the coastline of Kochi. That was the Fort Emmanuel. Okay, so that is the fort which is basically in news. So Fort Emmanuel, built out of laterite bricks. Now this Fort Emmanuel used to be a trading post for the movement of spices and other valuables. And the Portuguese navy, which was very, very strong, would significantly help the maintenance of this port. But very soon, the Dutch and the English destroyed this port. Within a few years of its construction, the port was almost destroyed. Significant portions of this fort now lies submerged across the coastline. Only when the water level is very low, if you go to Kochi, only when the water level is very low will you be able to look at these historic walls. So its conservation is being deemed to be very vital for the conservation of the cultural ethos of the history and the historical aspect of the region of Kochi. That is where many of the historians and many of the archaeologists and the people for the cultural conservation in the region, they are also urging the government to go for a full-fledged conservation of Fort Emmanuel, but along with that, go for the rebuilding of the sections of the fort with the same kind of bricks, so that it renders a kind of an imaginative power as well, so that it can be of better help. Okay? Now, then geroscience. Geroscience, the science related to aging. That is the portion relevant for your prelims here. In prelims, you can have a question, what do we mean by geroscience? So geroscience is a term which is derived from the terminology geriatric, which means referring to old age. Okay. So here, you have a group of scientists, individuals who are working towards understanding the process of aging. How does that aging happen? Because eventually, the psyche of the human mindset is what? You don't want to grow old, you don't want to age, isn't it? Everybody wants to reverse that aging process. So that is where geroscience is an area which is being worked upon. Now here, you have a scientist, that is Dr. Daniel Belsky, who is basically an epidemiologist in the Columbia University. Now what he has done, he has basically started observing the DNA of the older individuals. And he has found that as an individual grows older, there are increased methyl group secretions. Methyl groups, right? You have methyl, ethyl, alkylate groups, aldehydic groups, etc. So there is increased methyl group secretion in the enzymes of the DNA. And these enzymes, they further accelerate the process of aging. These lead to aging. And the scientists are working towards it, that if by the help of certain drugs, if by the help of certain supplements, if we are able to prevent the secretion of that enzyme, we can prevent aging. So that is why that particular enzyme, which consists of the methyl groups being secreted by the DNA, which leads to the aging, that is what is also referred to as the gerozyme. So while the various drugs are being tested that this can basically help prevent the secretion of gerozyme, means prevent aging or lead to a healthy aging, the study also points out that healthy aging means all your cognitive appearances are there, your cognitive ability is maintained. So that can be done if you have a maintenance of physical activities, regular physical activity, if you have consumption of proteins, both from non-vegetarian and vegetarian food, if you have the nutritious cereals like wheat, rice, millets, these nutritious cereals are consumed, if vegetables are consumed, that will lead to a kind of a healthy aging process. But out of this article, relevant for your prelims, what you have to extract is the case of geroscience, what is geriatric referring to, and what is gerozyme. Okay? Now, then moving on to the next article, particles that mimic platelet staunch traumatic bleeding. Now, this is a new research which has come to light where certain deformable microgels, right? Certain deformable microgels, they were found to have a property where in regions of excess bleeding, they could basically stop that bleeding. A work which is done by the platelets, isn't it? So platelets, the platelet count in your body is very important. Otherwise, the excess bleeding will lead to excessive blood loss. So that is where the blood clot and the clotting of the blood is also very important. You have the role of heparin, etc. also there, but platelets play the key role. Now the problem there is, whenever you have trauma or emergency accidents, it is in those cases that blood loss becomes a vital factor which can lead to the loss of life. In majority of the trauma victims, the cause of loss of life is the sudden blood loss. So for that, in order to prevent that, you need platelet injections and platelet which needs to be provided, right? Now the problem there is that with platelets, there is an expiration date as well. You need perfect conditions, ideal conditions for storage. You need ideal conditions for delivery mechanism as well. The development of this microgel in artificial system or an artificial particle means what? You can have a wider range in which you can have a storage. You can handle it in a much more robust manner, not in such a sensitive manner, and still it will work. So that means a better treatment possibility, a better curative possibility for the trauma victims. And that is something which can significantly lead to a reduction in the number of deaths caused due to road accidents and events of sudden emergency. Okay? Now, then coming to the last article, firms told to run gas units as power ask rises. Now, Indian Meteorological Department has already issued the warning and has come up with a news story which is not so good, and that is we are going to experience large number of days of heat waves, absolute heat waves being experienced. So these heat wave conditions, they are going to substantially increase, right? So as a result of that, the energy demand across the country is also projected to substantially rise up. The projections for this particular year, for the duration of April to June, that projection is already 260 gigawatt, right? Last year, the peak power demand was close to around 243 gigawatt, that too in September. This year, you have an increased amount of power which is going to be demanded by the public, required by the economy, required by the population. So the government is taking various different steps to ensure energy availability. One of them is that the power plants running on imported coal, they have been allowed to function all the way up till September. Generally, the cutoff date is earlier so that the import bill is reduced. But this time they have been allowed to operate all the way till September on only imported coal. Many of the power generating stations which were gas-based, now they have been lying idle for a long period of time, some of them even for decades. Those power stations have been asked to return to operations to generate that power, and that power will be utilized. So NTPC and Torrent Power, these are the two major gas-based power operations. Now, these are the ones who will start operating these gas-based power plants. Gas-based power plants also operate on a similar basis of generating heat, and that heat cycle leading to the formation of steam, which can lead to the movement of the turbine. But then the fuel intake is that of gas. So these gas-based power plants, they are being sought to fill up the plugs and the gaps which are present in the power demand and the power generation. Okay? Now, then the practice questions. Discuss the impact of heat waves and sea level rise in the coastal areas. So here, This is a 10-marker question. Now, in the introduction, you can write that due to events of global warming and the possibility of climate change upon us, there have been increased reporting of events of heat waves and sea level rise in the coastal areas across the tropics of the world. That's it. It is a 10-marker question, 25 words in introduction, that's it. You have told the evaluator that this is what I'm going to write about. Then in the body portion, start almost seamlessly talking about the fact that these heat waves in the coastal areas are primarily caused because of certain reasons. Talk about that also. Change in wind pattern, excessive amount of global warming, deforestation in the coastal landscape, distributed rainfall pattern or lack of rainfall because of deforestation and the change in the land use pattern. This leads to a heat wave developing. When the heat wave develops, with the help of image, drawing is important. With the help of image, talk about it, that how that higher temperature translates into the water body and that leads to a sea level rise due to thermal expansion. All of this with the help of the image itself, so that it becomes presentable as well and informative at the same time. Then talk about the impact of this coastal sea level rise, coastal flooding, agricultural loss, and the various different impacts that we have discussed about. If it would have been a 15-marker question, then you would have had a scope to provide the solution as well. It is only a 10-marker question. So in the conclusion, write the conclusion as a kind of a orientation towards way forward. That going ahead into the future, as the temperatures are supposed to climb up significantly more, mangrove plantation and vegetation in the coastal areas, barricading of the coastal lands, etc., are very vital for the maintenance of the coastal ecosystem, important for biodiversity and human survival. Okay? So that is where you provide a way forward and your answer is complete. Right? Then the second question. Highlight the reasons for a strong incidence of hepatitis infections in India and suggest measures for the same. Now, intro itself, if you provide data, that will carry significant amount of weight. So around 12%, you need not remember 11.6% exactly, just 12% or 11%. Around 12% of the global incidence or impact of hepatitis lies in India. And that is a worrisome fact, right? Talk about the fact that hepatitis B and C, they impact the working age population between 30 to 54 years majorly. Then talk about and list the facts of the reasons why they are happening. So do it in a kind of a sub-paragraph manner where you introduce a particular topic, for example, lack of clean drinking water, clean food and hygienic conditions. Underline that, write a couple of sentences. Due to poor urban housing situation, due to impoverishment in the urban slums, there's a genuine lack of clean drinking facilities, clean sanitation, which is leading to a greater event of hepatitis. Like that, list the various reasons that we have discussed. And after that, despite all these challenges, the measures which the government has taken and could be taken are, and there use a bubble format or a flowchart format and talk about the immunization needs to be much more widespread, better institutional delivery systems, better screening at primary healthcare centers, more awareness and educational system, all that you can measure. Eventually, you can talk about in the conclusion here that human capital is the best or the most vital form of resource that any country possesses. With hepatitis B and C claiming equal number of lives as tuberculosis and India suffering from both of them, we cannot foresee a future of a superpower if we are suffering from these malaise. That is why the need of the hour is to come together as community, as policymakers, as administrators, and take a uniform decision to get rid of the issue of this disease once and for all. So that is how you conclude your answer. Okay, so that is all that we are a discussion for today. Do write this answer. Try writing the answer in your own words. Write in the comments the answer for the various multiple choice questions that we have discussed. If you have liked the discussion, if you have understood this properly, please don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button. Till we meet again,